After drinking the human warrior's blood, she whispered, "You're my doom, human HFY in the distant reaches of the galaxy." Humanity found itself locked in a bitter war against the Valera Empire, an ancient and powerful race of warriors. The Valera had always prided themselves on their strength and honor, but now their empire faced the unthinkable, the relentless expansion of human colonies. The Valera believed their power would remain unchallenged, but they underestimated one thing: human determination. On a small, barren world at the edge of the empire, the humans had set up a hidden base to regroup and strike back. The Valera, as ruthless as they were, launched an assault in hopes of crippling the human resistance. Among the soldiers standing against them was Cade, a warrior of unmatched skill and resilience. Cade had earned his reputation not just through his victories in battle, but also his ability to stay calm under pressure. He was a natural-born leader, respected by his comrades, feared by his enemies. In the chaos of the battle, Cade and his unit had managed to capture one of the Valera's most feared warriors, Illyra, the queen of the Valera soldiers. She was a legend, known across the galaxy for her strength, her tactical genius, and her unbreakable will. Unlike the others of her species, Illyra was not just a fighter. She was a queen, and her presence commanded both respect and fear. She had been taken prisoner, her warrior spirit broken only by the sheer numbers of the human forces surrounding her. Cade stood over her now, watching as she struggled to regain her composure. Her once majestic armor was torn, and her regal posture was now slumped, though there was still a fierceness in her eyes. Her struggle to free herself from the restraints of her human captors was futile, but her pride would not allow her to show weakness. Cade knew this, and it intrigued him. There was something in her that resonated with him, something more than the hatred the Valera had for humanity. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, turned to meet Cade's. She said nothing at first, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The hatred in her gaze was palpable, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. She was a queen, after all, and queens did not bow to anyone, not even to the infamous human warrior standing before her. Cade wasn't sure what he expected from her, but he hadn't expected her silence. Most enemies would have taunted, cursed, or threatened, but Illyra held her tongue. Instead, she simply watched him, studying him with a look that felt more like an evaluation than an attempt to intimidate. "You're not like the others," she finally said, her voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "They speak of you as a legend among your kind." "I must admit I expected more, fire in your eyes," Cade smirked. "I'm not here to impress you," he said. "And you're not in a position to judge anyone right now, are you?" Illyra's lips twitched as if considering a response, but she did not retort. Instead, she seemed to relax, if only slightly. She leaned back against the wall of the makeshift cell, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to figure him out. Cade watched her carefully. He knew the importance of reading his enemies. In a way, this battle had become a game of chess, and he needed to understand his opponent's next move. What was she thinking? What drove someone like Illyra to fight so fiercely for a cause she believed in? And why was she so calm now? "I didn't expect a queen to be so composed when captured," Cade remarked, his tone curious. Illyra met his gaze again. "And I didn't expect humans to fight so fiercely. You are unlike anything I've seen before." Cade felt a flash of pride at her words, but he quickly dismissed it. This wasn't the time to get caught up in her compliments or play into her mind games. The Valera were dangerous. One mistake could cost him his life. For several long moments, neither spoke. Cade's mind raced with thoughts of their situation. He was tasked with keeping her under guard, yet something about Illyra intrigued him. She wasn't like the others, their prisoners who screamed and begged for mercy. She carried herself with dignity, even in defeat. It made her seem human in a way. Illyra broke the silence again, this time with a question. "Why do you fight?" Her voice was softer now, almost like she genuinely wanted to know. "Why do you continue this war when you know it will only lead to more death and destruction?" Cade was taken aback. He hadn't expected such a question from her, especially not in this situation. But the question wasn't unreasonable. He had asked himself the same thing many times since the war began. Why did they fight? Why not surrender? Why keep pushing forward, knowing how many lives were lost with every skirmish, every battle? "We fight for our future," Cade replied. "For the lives of those who can't fight for themselves. The colonies need us. Our people need us. We don't have a choice." Ilara looked thoughtful for a moment, as if the idea was foreign to her. "I've heard of your colonies," she said, "and your endless expansion. But we, the Valera, fight not for a future, we fight for survival. Your kind does not understand the weight of what it is to be an ancient species, threatened with extinction." Cade's brow furrowed. "Threatened with extinction? The Valera Empire doesn't look like it's on the verge of collapse." Ilara's eyes hardened. "Appearances can be deceiving, human. The Valera Empire is dying. Our people are few, and our strength has been dwindling for centuries. We fought and we conquered. But now we fight only to hold on to what little we have left." Cade felt a twinge of sympathy for her, though he would never show it. There was no room for sympathy in war, but something about her words resonated with him. Could it be true? Could the mighty Valera Empire really be on the verge of collapse? If they were fighting not just for power, but for survival, then what had they become? The sound of footsteps outside interrupted their conversation, and the door to her cell slid open. Cade straightened, his instincts kicking in as a fellow soldier entered. "I've been ordered to take you to the interrogation chamber," the soldier said. "Get moving." Ilara did not resist. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Cade's. There was something in that gaze, a quiet acknowledgement, maybe even a silent challenge, but Cade didn't flinch. He followed her out of the cell and into the hallway, his mind racing with everything they had discussed. As they walked, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this prisoner, was going to change everything. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Cade could feel it every time he entered the holding cell to check on Ilara. The air was thick with the unsaid, with an undeniable pull between them. She never spoke much, but her eyes never left him, as though she was studying him with the same intensity that he studied her. The Queen, once a symbol of invincibility, was now a prisoner of war, and Cade couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to her than the cold, calculating warrior he had been told to fear. Ilara's silence was unnerving. She didn't beg for mercy, nor did she fight back when she was moved from her cell to a more secure location. She simply walked, her head held high as if she still had control over her fate, but Cade saw through it. There was something in her, a vulnerability that she desperately tried to hide. He could see it in the way her posture slumped when she thought no one was watching, or how her eyes would drift away, as if lost in thoughts she didn't want to share. One evening, after the regular shift change, Cade entered the holding area to find Ilara sitting on the small cot, her eyes closed. The harsh light from the overhead lamp cast long shadows across her face, but Cade couldn't ignore the fact that she looked different. It wasn't just her outward appearance, her defiance had softened. There was something about the way she sat there, almost as if she had resigned herself to the reality of her capture. He hesitated at the door, unsure whether to disturb her or let her rest, but duty called. The humans needed answers, and she was the key. With a sigh, he stepped inside and cleared his throat, alerting her to his presence. Ilara's eyes snapped open, locking with his. For a moment they simply stared at each other, neither speaking, both evaluating the other. "I need to speak with you," Cade said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something else in it. He had never felt this conflicted about interrogating a prisoner before. There was a strange pull in the air, something he couldn't name. Ilara didn't move at first. Then slowly she stood up and walked toward him. "Speak," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "But know that I will not beg for mercy. I am a queen, and I will not break." Cade watched her approach, his gaze flicking to the chains around her wrists. Despite the shackles, she moved with the grace of a predator, every step deliberate and precise. He admired that about her, the sheer strength in her presence. "You've never asked why you're here," Cade said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why you were captured, why your people are fighting us. Don't you wonder why this war is happening, what you're really fighting for?" Ilara's expression hardened. "I know why I fight," she said, her tone cool and steady. "The Valera fight for survival. Our empire is dying, and I will not stand by and watch it fall into the hands of weaker races. We are strong. We are the true rulers of this galaxy." Cade shook his head. "You don't understand," he muttered. "The human colonies are not your enemies. We're just fighting for our future, too. We don't want war, we want peace. But peace cannot come until both sides stop seeing each other as enemies." Ilara's lips curled into a half-smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You are naive, human. The Valera do not seek peace. Peace is a luxury we cannot afford. It's not about survival anymore, it's about power. And we will stop at nothing to regain what we've lost." Cade felt a surge of frustration. He had heard this speech countless times from his commanders, but hearing it from her, someone who lived it, who had seen her empire crumble, made it all the more real. The Valera were not just fighting for dominance, they were fighting for their very survival. That was something Cade could understand. He had lost people to this war. His own family had been torn apart by the violence, but was it really worth it? Could there ever be a way to stop the fighting? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't just because of the war. It was something deeper, something they both sensed but neither fully understood. Ilara had called him naive, but Cade couldn't help feeling that in her eyes there was a flicker of something else. Was it regret? Was she questioning her own beliefs? "Why did you hesitate before?" Cade asked suddenly. "When we first met, you didn't act like the others. You didn't fight, you didn't scream. Why?" Ilara's expression softened just for a second before it turned cold again. "I fight because it is my duty," she said, her voice quieter now. "But there are things even a queen cannot control. I have seen the end of my empire. I have seen the destruction of everything I've ever known. And sometimes, Cade," she paused, as if choosing her words carefully, "sometimes it is easier to accept that there is no hope left." Cade felt a pang of sympathy. It was hard to imagine someone like her, someone so powerful, so proud, facing the reality of her people's downfall. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to watch everything he'd ever known crumble before him, and yet that was exactly what she was experiencing. "You don't have to accept it," Cade said, his voice softer now. "There's always hope. You don't have to keep fighting this war. We can end it." Ilara met his gaze, and for a moment, Cade thought he saw something in her eyes, something fragile, something human. But just as quickly, the cold mask of the warrior returned. She stepped back, her posture rigid once again. "I will not end this war," she said firmly. "Not until my people are safe, not until my empire is restored." Cade felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew she wasn't lying. The Valera were far too proud to surrender, far too stubborn to give up their fight. But something about her words struck a chord in him. He had seen it before, the way people clung to hope even when there was no reason to. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It could either save you or destroy you. The door to the holding area opened, and the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Cade turned to see a fellow soldier entering, a grim expression on his face. "We've got trouble," the soldier said. "The Valera are making a push near our eastern perimeter. They've gathered reinforcements. We need all hands on deck." Cade nodded and turned to Ilara one last time. "I'll be back," he said. "But remember this, not all humans are your enemies." Ilara didn't reply, but as Cade turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A small crack in the wall she had built around herself. A crack that, if he wasn't careful, could lead to something dangerous. As he left the room, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that their next encounter would be different. The question was, how would it change them both? The days grew longer, and the air around the camp seemed to thicken with the weight of an inevitable storm. Cade had fought in battles before, had faced enemies who screamed their hatred, who reveled in violence, but the war with the Valera was different. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for something much deeper. Every encounter, every clash felt like a step closer to an end neither side was ready for. Cade spent more time at the holding cells, unable to shake the memory of Ilara's eyes, the way they seemed to pierce through him, as if she could see the very core of his being. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him when he suggested the war could end. Her face had softened just for a moment before the familiar mask of the warrior queen returned. He didn't know what it was about her, but there was a connection forming, something unspoken. A bond, perhaps, built not on hatred, but on something far more complex. Cade didn't believe in destiny, but sometimes it felt like their paths were fated to cross. And with each passing day, that feeling only grew stronger. It wasn't long before Ilara's strange silence started to wear on him. She was no longer the defiant prisoner he had first encountered. There were moments when he would catch her staring at the stars through the small window of her cell, her expression distant, almost wistful. It was a side of her he hadn't expected, one that suggested she wasn't just a warrior, but a woman haunted by the weight of her past. Cade found himself drawn to those moments, wondering what thoughts ran through her mind. What had she seen? What had she lost? The queen was still a mystery, one he couldn't quite figure out, but it didn't stop him from trying. One evening, after the chaos of a raid by the Valera forces had settled, Cade found himself walking toward Ilara's cell once more. The camp had been on high alert, and everyone was exhausted from the constant fighting. But the war was far from over, and there was always more to be done. Yet, tonight, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he needed to understand about her. He found her sitting on the cot again, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She was staring at the floor, but the moment Cade entered, she looked up, her eyes sharp as ever. "You're here again," Ilara said, her voice low, almost resigned. "I suppose you've come to ask more questions. What's the point? You'll never understand." Cade didn't respond immediately. He simply walked over to the small bench across from her and sat down, keeping a careful distance between them. He had learned that with Ilara, space was important. She didn't like to be cornered, even in a cell. "I don't need to understand everything," he finally said. "I just want to understand you. Why do you keep fighting this war? What is it that you're really trying to protect?" Ilara's eyes flickered with something, anger maybe, but there was also something else there, something fragile. She opened her mouth to speak but paused. Her hands clenched into fists for a moment, then relaxed again. She was struggling with something, Cade could see that much. Whatever was inside her, it was buried deep. "I fight because it is my duty," she said, her tone as cold as ever, but there was a slight tremor beneath her words. "Because if I don't, the Valera will fall. My people will be nothing. And if that happens, the galaxy will be ruled by those who don't know what it means to have power, to have strength." Cade's brow furrowed. "But you're not the Valera Empire, Ilara. You're one person, one warrior. You can't carry the weight of an entire empire on your own. What if it's time to let go? What if the war ends and you have a chance to rebuild something else? Something better?" She let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "You think it's that easy? You think the Valera will just give up because you ask them to? We were once the rulers of this galaxy, human, and we will not bow to your colonies, not to anyone." Cade looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in days. She was fierce, proud, and broken in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The strength she carried, the weight of her duty, he could see it in her eyes, in the way she held herself. But there was also something lost in her, a part of her that had been shattered long ago. "You don't have to be a queen to be strong, Ilara," Cade said softly, leaning forward slightly. "You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders." Ilara's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she regarded him carefully. She seemed to weigh his words, her mind racing through thoughts Cade couldn't even begin to guess at. Then, without warning, she stood up. The sudden motion was sharp, and for a brief second, Cade thought she might lash out. But instead, she walked over to the small window of her cell, her back turned to him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice distant now. "You can never understand. You're too young, too naive." She turned slightly, enough for him to see the shadows of pain in her eyes. "I've seen things you can't even imagine. I've seen my people die. I've seen my empire fall. I've seen everything, and now I'm the last of my kind. The last of the Valera warriors who remember what it was like to rule." Cade's heart sank. He had known, on some level, that Ilara carried a heavy burden. But hearing her say it, hearing the rawness in her voice, it made him realize just how much she had lost, and how much she was willing to fight for, even if it meant fighting against a future she no longer believed in. "How do you live with that?" Cade asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ilara's shoulders tensed, but she didn't answer right away. For a long moment she stood there, silent. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You survive," she said simply. "Because if you don't, you die, and that's not an option." Cade could feel the weight of her words, the truth behind them. He had seen it too, the way people fought, the way they clung to life, to hope, even when there seemed to be no reason to keep going. He understood that. But Ilara wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something much deeper, a belief that her people could rise again, that the Valera could reclaim their place in the galaxy. And Cade realized something then. He realized that he wasn't just fighting for peace, for a future free from war. He was also fighting for the people like Ilara, the ones who had lost everything, the ones who couldn't let go of their past. He didn't know if he could ever change her mind, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let her face it alone. "I don't know what will happen to you, Ilara," Cade said, standing up and walking toward her. "I don't know if we can end this war. But I do know that no one should have to carry the weight of their people's future alone." Ilara turned to face him then, her eyes filled with something Cade couldn't quite name. Maybe it was uncertainty, or maybe it was something deeper, something more personal. She didn't speak for a long time, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "Then stay with me," she said softly. "Stay and help me find a way out of this. Help me find a way to end this before it destroys everything." Cade's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't hesitate. He nodded slowly. "I will, I promise." In that moment, as they stood there together, Cade realized something important. They weren't enemies anymore. They weren't just prisoner and guard, soldier and queen. They were two people, bound by a war that neither of them truly wanted, but neither of them could escape. And for the first time since this war began, Cade felt like there was hope, not just for humanity, but for them both. The tension between Cade and Alara had reached a point where neither of them could ignore it any longer. They had shared their thoughts, their fears, and in a way, their hopes, but the war they were trapped in had a momentum of its own. The conflict between the human colonies and the Valera Empire was far from over, and no matter how many conversations they had or how much they understood one another, the outside world refused to give them the peace they both secretly craved. Cade could see it in Alara's eyes every time they met, a flicker of doubt. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She was questioning herself, her role in this war, her place in the universe. For so long, she had been the queen, the fierce warrior who led her people through countless battles. But now, standing on the precipice of defeat, Alara was grappling with a reality she never thought she'd face. She was no longer the ruler of an empire. She was just one soldier, one warrior struggling to hold on to the legacy of her people. Cade had noticed a change in her over the last few days. She no longer seemed as distant, as unreachable. There was a vulnerability in her now, a weariness that wasn't there before. She still carried herself with dignity, but the cracks in her armor were beginning to show, and Cade couldn't help but feel responsible for it. After all, it was his blood that had caused the shift, the strange connection they shared after he had been injured, and Alara had healed by drinking his blood. What had started as an act of survival had turned into something neither of them could control. Their conversations had grown more frequent, more honest, but the tension between them was also building. They spoke of the past, of what had brought them to this point, but they had never truly spoken of what the future might hold. What would happen after the war was over? If it was ever over, that is. One evening, after another failed attempt at diplomacy between the human leaders and the Valera generals, Cade found himself walking toward Alara's cell again. His mind was clouded with frustration. It seemed like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. The Valera refused to surrender, the humans were growing impatient, and Cade had to wonder if there was any hope left for peace. When he entered the holding area, he didn't immediately see her. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls, but then he heard the soft sound of her voice, low as if she were speaking to herself. Cade paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt. "I have fought for so long," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have bled for my people, for my empire, and now I wonder if it was all for nothing. If I had been willing to change, to accept what was coming, could I have saved them? Could I have saved myself?" Cade felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't sure what had prompted her to speak aloud, but it sounded like she was talking more to herself than to him. Yet he couldn't ignore the pain in her voice. She wasn't just questioning the war, she was questioning everything she had stood for, everything she had fought to protect. It was the same thing Cade had seen in his own people, the desperation, the fear of losing everything. "Alara," Cade said softly, stepping into the room. She turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes locked in silence. "You're not alone in this." Her gaze softened, but she didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, as if she were trying to see past the warrior he had been trained to be, into the man who stood before her. Cade could feel her studying him, just as he had studied her countless times before. "I never wanted this war," Cade continued, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I didn't want to fight against you, against your people, but here we are on opposite sides, and I don't know if there's any way out. I don't know how to fix this." Alara lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable. "The war is not just about us anymore," she said, her voice quiet but with an edge of bitterness. "It's about everything we've lost. It's about power and pride, about what's left after so much destruction. I don't know how to stop it either." Cade approached her slowly, carefully, as if he were stepping into uncharted territory. He had never been one to hesitate in battle, but now, with her, this warrior queen who had once held the fate of her people in her hands, he was unsure of his next move. You don't have to carry this weight alone, Cade said, his voice low but sincere. I'm here, I want to help. But I need to know, what do you really want, Elara? What do you want to fight for now? She stood still for a long moment, and Cade could see her wrestling with her thoughts. The silence between them grew heavy, almost unbearable, but eventually she spoke, her words barely audible. I want to stop this, she said, almost as if she were saying it to herself more than to him. I want to stop the endless fighting. I want to find a way out of this madness, but I don't know if it's possible anymore. My people. They will never forgive me if I abandon this fight. They will see me as weak, as a traitor. Cade stepped closer, his heart aching for her. He could see the internal battle she was facing. The fear, the shame, the desire to protect what was left of her people, even if it meant continuing a war that had already cost too much. You're not weak, Elara, Cade said gently. You're human just like me. And sometimes, being human means making hard choices. It means facing the truth and doing what's right, even if it's not easy. You don't have to fight for your people if it means destroying them in the process. You don't have to be their queen to lead them towards something better. For a long time, Elara said nothing. Cade could see the war raging in her mind, the struggle between her duty as a queen and her longing for peace. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. I don't know how to do that, she whispered. I don't know how to let go of everything I've ever known. Cade reached out, a gesture of comfort, but he stopped just before touching her. He understood her hesitation. She had been a warrior her entire life. This was more than just a matter of surrendering in battle. It was about surrendering a part of herself that she had held onto for so long. You don't have to do it alone, Cade said, his voice firm but kind. We'll figure this out together. Elara's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, Cade saw a glimpse of the person she used to be, the one who fought not just for power but for her people's future. That person was still there, buried beneath the layers of war and grief. It would take time, but Cade believed she could find her way back. As the two of them stood there, the world outside seemed to fade away. There was no war, no enemies, no generals barking orders, just two people caught in the midst of something much greater than themselves. And for the first time in a long while, Cade felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the end of the war, nor was it the end of their struggles, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile thread of hope woven between them. Cade didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if their connection would lead to the end of the war or if it would unravel completely. But he knew one thing: they were no longer enemies. They were allies in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. And that was enough for now. The war had raged on for what felt like an eternity, each day a blur of gunfire, explosions, and endless strategies to outmaneuver the enemy. Cade was tired, so tired that even his sharp mind seemed to dull under the weight of it all. But there was something different in the air now, something that made him feel like he was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. It had been days since his conversation with Elara, and though the war continued to unfold outside the camp's walls, inside everything felt still. Every time he passed by her cell, he noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. She wasn't as cold, not as distant as she had been when they first met. She had begun to open up, though just slightly. It was as though the conversation they'd had broken something open, letting the smallest crack of vulnerability peek through the stone walls she had built around herself. Cade could feel it too. The tension that had once been there between them had softened. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but every time their eyes met, there was an understanding between them. It was strange, this feeling of connection with someone who had once been his enemy. He had never expected it. But now he couldn't deny that there was something between them that he couldn't explain, something that went beyond the battlefield, beyond their positions as soldier and prisoner. It was a shared weight, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything. One evening, after another round of failed negotiations and a particularly difficult skirmish, Cade found himself walking toward Elara's cell again. He had been avoiding it for a few days, unsure of what more he could say to her. But today, something felt different. It was as if he could no longer ignore the unspoken bond between them. When he entered the room, Elara was sitting on her cot, her back straight, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, almost serene, though Cade knew it was a mask. Beneath that calm exterior was a storm of emotions that she had yet to fully confront. He stepped closer, and her eyes fluttered open, locking with his almost instantly. "You're here again," Elara said, a slight, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Are you looking for answers or just company?" Cade felt a small smile form on his own face. "Maybe a little of both," he said, taking a step closer but still keeping some distance. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the war, about your people. And I've been wondering if there's really any way out of this mess." Ilara didn't respond immediately, and for a moment the silence between them was comfortable. It wasn't tense, wasn't filled with the usual animosity that had once defined their interactions. Instead, it was a quiet space where they could both just be. "You're still asking the same questions, Cade," Ilara said softly, her voice almost wistful. "The same question that everyone asks when they've been fighting for so long. How do we end it? But I don't have the answer. I don't think anyone does." Cade nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he said. "But sometimes you have to look for the answers where you least expect them, and maybe the answer isn't just in winning the war, maybe it's in something else." Ilara looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Cade hesitated, unsure if he could put his thoughts into words. But when he looked at her, he realized that it wasn't just about the war anymore. It was about both of them. It was about the choices they would make, not just as warriors, but as people. And for the first time, Cade didn't feel the need to hide behind his duty. He felt like he could speak the truth without fear of judgment. "I think the answer is in understanding each other," Cade said, his voice steady. "In finding a way to stop seeing each other as enemies. I know it's not easy. I know we're both carrying things that the other can't fully understand. But maybe if we're willing to listen, if we're willing to see each other as something more than just soldiers, we can find a way out, a way to end this. Not with blood, but with something else." Ilara's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed to let her guard down just a little. "And you think we can do that?" she asked quietly. "You think we can stop this war by talking?" "I don't know," Cade admitted, "but I think it's worth trying. I think we owe it to ourselves to try." The air between them grew heavier, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was as though, for the first time, they were both acknowledging the depth of what was happening between them. The weight of their past, their choices, and their shared future. Cade could feel it, the realization that no matter what happened, this moment, this exchange, was something that would change them both. Ilara didn't speak for a while. She simply stood up and walked to the small window of her cell, her hands resting on the cold metal bars as she stared out into the night. Cade stood back, giving her space, knowing that she was processing everything he had said. He could see the conflict in her body language, the way she stood with her shoulders tense, the way her fists clenched at her sides. But when she turned back to face him, there was something different in her eyes, a glimmer of something that Cade hadn't seen before. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "I don't know what the future holds," Ilara said, her voice steady but soft. "But I know this, I can't keep fighting this war the way I have been. I can't keep doing this, Cade. I've lost too much already." Cade stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know," he said gently, "I know. I've lost my people," Ilara continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I've lost my empire, I've lost everything I thought I knew, but maybe it's time to let go. Maybe it's time to stop fighting a war that has already cost too much." Cade reached out then, his hand brushing hers lightly. It was a small gesture, but it was a moment of connection, a moment where everything felt possible. For the first time in what felt like forever, Cade felt the weight of the war lift, if only for a second. "You don't have to do it alone," Cade whispered. "I'm with you. We'll figure this out together." Ilara looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, though she refused to let them fall. "Together," she echoed softly. The two of them stood there, in the quiet of the holding cell, in the stillness of the night. The war continued to rage outside, but for the first time, Cade felt a sense of peace settle over him. There were no promises, no guarantees, but there was something more powerful than any weapon they had ever used: trust. They trusted each other, and that was a beginning. As the hours passed and the sounds of distant explosions echoed through the camp, Cade and Ilara sat together, sharing the silence. They didn't speak of the future, or of what the world outside would look like when the war was over. Instead, they simply shared the present, knowing that this moment, this connection, was enough. And in that moment, Cade knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side.